welcome to a special edition of WION Global Leadership Series. The world we know is fighting a pandemic. The coronavirus outbreak needs global cooperation, not just to contain the virus, but also to handle the aftermath of this outbreak. But the world today is more divided than ever before. Leaders of various countries differ on the right approach to handle this crisis. Global bodies like the United Nations are struggling to build consensus. Is there a way to break this deadlock? What is the right approach for recovery? To discuss this and more, I'm joined today by Helen Clark, the former Prime Minister of New Zealand. Ms. Clark has not just served as the head of state, but she was also the first woman to serve as the head of the United Nations Development Programme. Thank you so much for being with us here on WION. Helen Clark, my first question to you is, how is New Zealand coping with the pandemic?
New Zealand is actually having a lot of success in moving towards its goal of elimination of COVID-19 here. As of today, and this is basically the last day of our very severe first month of lockdown, we had exactly 3 new cases. We know exactly where they came from existing clusters of cases. So we appear to be completely on top of any community transmission. And in a few days' time, we will go down a level from our top alert for COVID-19. So we're feeling quietly positive here in New Zealand.
That's very good to know. New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has been called the most effective leader on the planet when it comes to fighting COVID-19. Do you agree with this assessment?
I think Jacinda Ardern has been very effective. She's one of a number of women leaders who the world is noticing as having led successful responses. For example, a woman leader in Iceland, woman leader in Denmark. There's quite a list of young women leaders like Jacinda who are seen to have handled this pandemic crisis extremely well.
The road ahead is going to be difficult, we all understand. Estimates say that the jobless rate in New Zealand will jump to 13% even if the lockdown is lifted quickly, and the GDP is going to decline by 1/3. And this is just for New Zealand. The whole world, in fact, is bracing for a recession. And yet there are leaders who've put economic recovery above saving lives. Is this a real choice and the right approach, according to you?
No, it's not a real choice and it's not the right approach. My strong view is that if a country bungles the public health response, the economic damage will be longer and deeper. So for New Zealand, absolutely the right strategy is to move to elimination. It's been tough this first month. There are people who are out of work and having to go to a food bank for support for the first time ever in their lives. But we do have a lot of government support for businesses, professions, for families, workers displaced. We're going to get through this. But, of course, our bigger concern now will be the wider world. When does the world get through it? Because New Zealand is a small export-oriented economy. It's had a big tourism sector, and we can't do well if the rest of the world isn't doing well.
How do you think this pandemic will impact the upcoming election in September in your country?
So in New Zealand, there's been, broadly speaking, a political consensus that the strategy being followed is right. Of course, oppositions exist to oppose the government, so you get a difference of opinion about how long a lockdown should go on for, what should be closed off, what shouldn't. But generally, there's a consensus. My judgment would be, though, that the Prime Minister has done so well as a leader for New Zealand at this most challenging of times in the lifetimes of any of us, that her prospects would have to be pretty positive.
This is a question that most democracies struggle to answer properly. So I want to put this to you. Do you believe lack of political consensus can be a hindrance in situations like these?
Yes, because it has to be a whole-of-country effort. And one point Jacinda Ardern has continually made is that this is a team of almost 5 million people, and we're working together. And overwhelmingly, New Zealanders have supported and enforced the very, very strict measures. We're not supposed to go further from our homes than we can physically walk. We only have essential services open this past month. There have been relatively few breaches of this relative to the size of the population. So engaged populations are critical to taking on beating the pandemic.
And where does that leave your right to criticize the government and to raise issues if there are? How do you balance the two is my question.
New Zealand has kept functioning parliamentary democracy going through the state of emergency. The full parliament is in recess, but a special oversight committee of parliament for this emergency was created. It's chaired by the leader of the opposition. It has opposition MPs and government MPs on it. They call witnesses, including ministers, senior officials, representatives of different sectors of the economy and society, and all the issues are aired. And as I say, in a democracy, everyone's got a point of view. Some think not enough's being done for them. Others think the lockdown should be lifted earlier. It's all debated. And I think around a response to a pandemic like this, transparency, openness, constant communication from government as to why the decisions are being taken is incredibly important.
I think this is a good lesson and a good template for the rest of the world to follow. Helen Clark, you've been part of the United Nations Development Programme, you've headed it, and you understand how the system works better than most others. Why did the UN fail in its response to this pandemic?
So the UN is a multi-layered beast, of course, and I do want to give a shout out to the WHO, which 4 months ago had never heard of this virus. It hears at the end of December. It responds with the information it has. It gives guidance, but not enough countries follow its guidance. Then you come to the UN agencies out in the field. The World Food Programme couldn't be trying harder. Its head appeared in front of the Security Council this week and said, look, if something dramatic's not done, we are facing a doubling of the numbers of people who are on the brink of starvation in our world. That's horrific. So I know from my experience that the agencies out in the country level, the World Food Programs, the UNICEFs, the UNDPs, the International Organisation of Migration, the Refugee Agency, they'll all be working incredibly hard at the country level. So where then is the real issue? The real issue is here. The Security Council has been unable to agree on a resolution. In 2014, the Security Council resolved that Ebola was a threat to global peace and security. We have had no such resolution in the middle of this terrible crisis, which with global ramifications goes far beyond the Ebola one. So that's a vacuum of leadership at the top political level of the United Nations. Secondly, at the level of the G20, which was so critical in mobilizing the global response to the financial crisis of 2007 to 9, the leaders of the G20 have not stepped up to ensure that the resources are available to the IMF, to the World Banks, to the regional development banks to support countries through this crisis. There are many more countries which need their debt payments suspended than the 25 that the IMF has the funding to support. And so it goes. There need to be hundreds of millions of dollars of new special drawing rights from the International Monetary Fund. Actually, a package of around $2 trillion needs to be mobilised, but we're really seeing the petty cash of that coming forward at the moment. So at the global leadership level, we are not seeing what happened with Ebola, and we are not seeing what happened with the global financial crisis.
Right, that's a very, very important point that you're making. You spoke about the lack of a UNSC resolution and the lack of leadership. Are some leaders in some countries, would you say, more to blame than others for hampering this?
So we have rather toxic geopolitics at the moment. And if you, as a major country with a veto power on the Security Council, enter the room with the attitude that you are determined to have in the resolution a name for the virus, which is not the scientific name, but the name of the place where it came from, then you know that you really don't want a resolution. You're just into a blame game. And this is so distressing. People are dying out there now in their hundreds of thousands. It's just not appropriate for this sort of behaviour to carry on in the middle of a global crisis like this.
Right. You've not named names, but you have in the past called U.S. President Donald Trump's decision to hold back funds from the WTO, quote-unquote, foolish. I want to ask you why that is, and the follow-up question is that if you believe that the American leadership has failed, what do you make of the Chinese leadership and its approach to this?
So to withdraw funding from the World Health Organization in the middle of a pandemic is clearly foolish. About 15% of the WHO's budget comes from the United States of America, and actually the biggest share of that funding goes to very important programs like the moving to the final eradication of polio, which we all support. Look, the WHO has been scrambling like everyone else to try to get ahead of what this virus means and give the right guidance. And, it will do a review after this, and not everything will be 100% right. But where would the world be without the WHO? We have to support it. We have to strengthen its mandate. Now, for it to be fully effective, of course, it needs the full cooperation of all member states. And that means that at the very first hint of a new virus like this, the country that it appears in must go to the WHO. In the case of SARS, as I recall, back in around 2003, it took some 3 months for China to notify. This time, it's not clear how long the government in Beijing knew about it, but I would think almost certainly at least sometime before the 31st of December notification. So we need transparency and openness from every member state if we're to get on top of a virus like this very, very quickly. And we need all member states cooperating with, supporting the WHO to do its critical job.
I want to dwell on the point of the role of the WHO. You mentioned SARS. When the SARS outbreak happened, Helen Clark, the WHO issued a travel ban very promptly, and it's first in almost 6 decades. But with this coronavirus pandemic, it was not even declared a pandemic until it reached 85 countries. Do you believe that supporting the WHO in its current shape and form, with all the questions and the criticism coming its way, is our only option?
It is the only option. With respect to the use of the word pandemic, I understand that it doesn't have an official meaning in the WHO range of declarations, but it is a term that we as lay people all understand. And eventually Dr. Tedros did use the word pandemic. But remember, back at the very end of January, he declared a public health emergency of global concern. And, that means get busy. Every country get busy. What was really quite surprising when you look back on it is how the greatest and most powerful countries and economies on earth, the G7, seemed to watch this as though it was something that was happening in China and wouldn't affect them. And then it has rolled through the G7 countries with their sophisticated health systems and caused absolute havoc, which is why many of us are so concerned about it reaching countries with much weaker health infrastructure and weaker economies, and the damage it can do there when we've seen what it's done in the global north. Now, on the question of travel bans, the WHO doesn't advocate them and it doesn't endorse them. I'm a New Zealander. My country put a ban on travel from China at the very end of January, beginning of February. And then later in February, it also put a ban on travel from Iran. And I think that is totally justified. It was a way of stopping a lot of entry of the virus. And other countries did the same, the United States being one of them. But the WHO has to navigate very turbulent waters geopolitically. And I think one of its concerns would be that if it said put on a travel ban, it might alienate countries whose cooperation it actually requires. So I think countries will do, with respect to travel bans, what they think is right for them. My country certainly did, the US did, others did, but don't expect the WHO to be making public statements endorsing it.
Right. We'll leave the question of the WHO for the moment. I think I'll ask the rest to them when I get a chance to speak to them. The pandemic, as you said, has exposed the lack of global leadership. An online petition is now calling for you, Helen Clark, to take on a new role linking leaders to resources and funding supporting the World Health Organization. Is that something that you're open to doing, and what will your strategy be?
No, I've got no intention of doing any such thing. You know, I have a rather busy life, leading a number of international organisations and being on the boards of others. So I prefer to stay as an informed commentator. But because I was a long-serving leader of my country, 9 years, and a long-serving UNDP administrator, 8 years and 2 terms, I have a lot of insights into what can happen at the global level. And I think there is an appalling leadership vacuum at the moment, from the UN Security Council to the G20 leadership. I see organisations like the IMF with its executive director, Kristalina Georgieva, wanting to do the right thing, but they haven't got the resources. And my appeal is to the leaders of great nations on the Security Council and in the G20 leaders grouping, please step up. Because if you don't, this virus is not only going to be responsible for countless more deaths, but it is going to cast many more people back into poverty, many to the brink of starvation, and be absolutely ruinous for economies. We can think of the least developed countries and the way it might ravage their economies. Think also of the upper middle income small island developing states, such as those in the Indian Ocean, like Seychelles, like Mauritius, like Maldives, which are utterly dependent on tourism for their living. And that just got wrecked. So really, we need the global leaders to step up and do their job and accept their responsibility for an effective and coordinated response.
Absolutely. My final question, this is already being called a watershed moment in human history. How, according to you, will this pandemic change the world?
Well, one way it will change is that we will go backwards on the cause of eradication of extreme poverty. By how much remains to be seen. I've seen a range of estimates, the World Bank probably at the lower end, saying 40 to 60 million. People, not a small number, others going substantially higher than that. Clearly it's going to be a world with a lot more acute hunger, people on the verge of starvation. It's going to be a world where people fear to travel for quite some time yet. It's going to be a world where I think we will have learned a lot from the period of lockdown and isolation about how we actually work. And I predict less people will be working in their offices and more will be working from their homes. The companies like the Zooms, the Teams, those who manage Google platforms, these are going to be the kinds of ways people will interact a great deal more than they ever did before. Could we see this as a transformative moment when we try to design a world that is fairer, more equitable, more sustainable, reduces greenhouse gas footprints? That would be a wonderful thing to come out of this if we follow the old saying that it's an ill wind that blows no good. But at the moment, it's blowing very, very ill. And one wonders whether, rather than taking that opportunity for transformative change, people will just want to get back to something as near as business as usual as fast as they can. And I think that would be a mistake. I think we need to learn from this.
Lots of lessons to learn, of course. Helen Clark, thanks very much for your time and for sharing your thoughts with us. Stay safe. That'll be all on this edition of the Global Leadership Series. Keep watching WION.